Welcome back to another peaceful journey through Scripture. Take a deep breath, let the worries of the day fade, and allow your heart to settle into stillness. Tonight, we reflect on a moment of divine power and perfect peace, when Jesus calmed the storm. Life can often feel like waves crashing around us with uncertainties that shake our hearts. Yet, in the midst of the storm, there is one who speaks peace. Just as he calmed the sea, he offers rest to our souls, a stillness beyond understanding. Picture the gentle rocking of a boat on quiet waters, the soft whispers of the wind, the night sky stretching endlessly above. Even when storms arise, even when the waves grow wild, his presence remains. He is with us in the calm, and he is with us in the storm. So, find a comfortable place, close your eyes if you wish, and let this story soothe your heart and mind as we begin. The evening was settling over the Sea of Galilee, casting a tranquil glow over the waters as the last traces of daylight faded into the horizon. The disciples and Jesus had spent the day teaching and sharing parables with the crowds gathered by the shore. As the people began to leave, tired and full from hearing the wisdom of Jesus, the air was filled with a quiet stillness, broken only by the gentle sound of the waves lapping against the shore. It was during this peaceful moment that Jesus, knowing what lay ahead, turned to his disciples with a request: "Let us go across to the other side." The disciples, familiar with the Sea of Galilee and its calm waters, agreed without hesitation. They had crossed this very sea many times, knowing its rhythms and the signs of impending storms. However, this journey would be unlike any they had made before. As the disciples boarded the boat with Jesus, the evening air was cool, and the stars began to appear overhead. The stillness of the water seemed to promise a calm journey. The disciples, many of whom were fishermen by trade, likely felt confident in their ability to navigate the sea. After all, they had crossed these waters countless times. But little did they know, this night would bring a challenge they hadn't anticipated. The Sea of Galilee, though serene in appearance, was known for its unpredictable nature. It was nestled between steep hills, which made it vulnerable to sudden and violent storms. Winds would often descend quickly, stirring up fierce waves that could turn even the calmest waters into a deadly force. The disciples, despite their familiarity with the sea, knew well that such storms could come without warning, and they had seen the power of nature on this lake before. But the storm that was about to arise was far greater than anything they could have imagined. Jesus, having just finished a day of teaching, was physically exhausted. He knew the trials they would face on this journey, but he also knew the peace that comes from trusting in God. As the boat began to move away from the shore, the disciples settled into their places, unaware of what was about to unfold. With the boat gliding smoothly through the water and the cool night air settling around them, the disciples likely assumed the crossing would be like any other. However, the tranquility of the evening was about to be shattered. As they sailed further into the lake, the wind began to stir. At first, it was only a gentle breeze, but it quickly grew stronger. The sea, which had been calm just moments ago, began to shift, and the disciples felt the first signs of something ominous in the air. The waves began to grow, slowly at first, but then with increasing speed and force. The disciples, already on edge, sensed the danger rising. The peaceful boat ride was quickly becoming a struggle to stay afloat. They knew something was wrong. The wind increased in ferocity, coming down from the surrounding hills, sweeping across the lake's surface and creating massive waves that struck the boat with greater intensity. The disciples, many of whom were seasoned fishermen, immediately recognized the signs of a serious storm. This was not a normal evening breeze. This was a storm unlike any they had faced before. The boat rocked more violently now, and water began to splash over the sides, soaking them as the waves crashed around them. The disciples scrambled to secure the boat, their hands moving quickly in a desperate attempt to keep the vessel afloat. But the storm seemed to rise in intensity with every passing moment. The waves were growing higher, the wind fiercer. The boat was tossed in every direction, and the sound of the wind and the crashing waves drowned out everything else. It felt as if the sea itself was threatening to swallow them whole. At this point, panic began to creep into the hearts of the disciples. They had been on these waters before, had navigated storms in the past, but this storm felt different. It was as if the very forces of nature were being unleashed in a way they had never experienced. They struggled to stay on their feet as the boat tilted and shifted violently, their hands slipping on the wet surfaces, their hearts racing. Despite their best efforts, the boat was being overwhelmed by the power of the storm. The fear in the disciples' hearts grew, and they could no longer deny the seriousness of their situation. It was clear that they were in immediate danger, and the fear of perishing loomed over them with every crash of a wave. In the midst of this chaos, the disciples knew they needed help, but help seemed distant, even as they continued to fight the storm. And though the wind screamed in their ears and the water soaked them to the bone, there was one thing that remained strangely constant: the presence of Jesus. He had not moved, and in that moment it felt as though he was unbothered by the storm's fury. While the storm continued to rage around them, one figure in the boat remained undisturbed. The disciples, struggling against the violent waves and howling wind, couldn't help but notice that Jesus was fast asleep. The boat rocked and swayed violently, water splashing over the edges, yet Jesus remained at peace, his head resting gently on a cushion. The contrast between the disciples' frantic efforts and Jesus' tranquil slumber was striking. The disciples, terrified for their lives, fought desperately to keep the boat afloat. Their faces were filled with fear, their hands trembling as they tried to steer and bail water. Every wave felt like a threat to their survival, and the wind seemed determined to push them under. And yet, Jesus slept. It was as though the storm, no matter how fierce or threatening, had no effect on him. The noise of the crashing waves, the furious wind, the chaos surrounding them, none of it disturbed his rest. It was a peace that seemed to defy all human understanding. In the midst of life's fiercest storm, Jesus slept soundly, unbothered by the violent forces around him. The disciples couldn't comprehend it. How could he sleep through this? How could he remain so calm when everything around them seemed to be falling apart? It wasn't just the physical storm that caused the disciples fear. It was the feeling of helplessness, the overwhelming sense that they were completely out of control. The waves were too high, the wind too strong, and they felt powerless against it all. They had no way of knowing how to navigate through this storm or how much longer they could keep fighting. They had seen Jesus perform miracles, heal the sick, and speak with divine wisdom. But this storm was different. It was not something they could control with their skills or knowledge. It felt like nature itself had turned against them. And yet, here was Jesus, sleeping as if none of it mattered. For the disciples, it was a moment of confusion and frustration. How could he be sleeping while they were on the verge of drowning? They had given everything they had to keep the boat afloat, but nothing seemed to stop the storm from worsening. They were growing more desperate by the minute, their minds filled with dread. But Jesus slept on, his peace unshaken. This profound calm was not due to ignorance or indifference. Rather, it was the perfect peace that comes from total trust in God's sovereignty. Jesus knew that he was safe in his Father's hands, no matter the storm that raged outside. His sleep wasn't a sign of neglect or carelessness, but of perfect trust in the Father's will. As the disciples struggled, they realized that they had reached the point where they could do no more. The storm was simply too much for them to handle. That was when they decided they had no choice but to wake Jesus, hoping that he could do something, anything, to save them from the peril they faced. Perhaps they felt that if he saw what was happening, he would act, just as he had done so many times before with the sick and the suffering. They needed him now more than ever. "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" they cried out, their voices filled with fear and urgency. The words spilled out of them almost as if they were accusing him of neglect. How could he be asleep while they were in such danger? Didn't he care about their lives? Didn't he see how badly the storm was threatening them? For a moment, it seemed as if the storm itself might be louder than their cries. But in the midst of the chaos, their desperation was clear. The disciples' words carried a heavy weight of uncertainty and doubt. They were no longer certain that they would make it through this storm. They were gripped by fear, and in that moment of vulnerability, they turned to the one person they knew could help, Jesus. But even as they cried out to him, the question lingered in their hearts. Was he really concerned about them? How could he sleep so peacefully in the face of such danger? The storm seemed to mock their helplessness, and yet Jesus was still. In this moment, the disciples were learning something deeper about their faith and their understanding of Jesus. They had followed him, witnessed his miracles, and listened to his teachings. But this was different. This storm tested their trust in him, and in their fear, they found themselves questioning his care and his power. They needed to hear from him. They needed to know that he cared and that he could save them. In the midst of the storm's furious rage, Jesus was awakened by the cries of his disciples. His rest, which had been so undisturbed, was interrupted by their fearful call for help. As the disciples stood around him, drenched from the storm's fury, their faces etched with panic and anxiety, Jesus slowly sat up. There was no urgency in his movements, no sign of the fear that had consumed his followers. Instead, there was only calm, a peace that seemed to defy the chaos surrounding them. For a moment, the only sound in the boat was the relentless howling of the wind, the crashing of waves, and the disciples' labored breathing. They were breathless from both the storm and their own terror. They had expected Jesus to immediately rise and take control, to command the storm to cease. But what they didn't expect was the profound question that came from his lips. "Why are you so afraid?" Jesus asked them. His voice was calm, yet firm, like a gentle rebuke, carrying the weight of compassion. "Do you still have no faith?" His words were a piercing contrast to the turmoil that gripped the hearts of the disciples. The question hung in the air, pregnant with meaning. It wasn't merely an inquiry into their fear. It was an invitation to examine the depth of their trust in him. Jesus knew that their fear was rooted not just in the storm, but in their wavering faith. The disciples had been with Jesus for some time now, witnessing his miracles and hearing his teachings. They had seen him heal the sick, cast out demons, and perform countless wonders. Yet, in this moment, faced with the very real danger of the storm, their faith faltered. Their fear blinded them to the truth that had been right in front of them all along, that the one who had performed such great miracles was with them in the boat. Their panic revealed the fragility of their trust in him, and Jesus gently but firmly pointed it out. His question was not one of condemnation, but of invitation. Jesus was calling them to a deeper faith, a trust that transcended their circumstances. He was inviting them to believe in his power and his care, even when the world seemed to be falling apart around them. His words cut through the storm, reaching the heart of their fear. And with that, Jesus stood up, his movement steady and sure. He faced the storm head on, his eyes fixed on the raging waves in the darkened sky above. Without hesitation, he raised his hand, and with a single word, he commanded the storm to cease. "Peace, be still," he spoke, his voice filled with authority. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of the Creator himself. They were not mere words of a man, but the command of the Son of God, the one who held all authority over creation. The moment the words left his mouth, something incredible happened. The wind, which had been howling with unrelenting fury, instantly stopped. The waves, which had been crashing violently against the boat, grew still. The storm that had seemed unstoppable now lay at the feet of Jesus, subdued and silenced. It was as if the very forces of nature bowed in submission to his will. The disciples stood in stunned silence, their eyes wide with disbelief. They had never seen anything like this before. They had witnessed Jesus heal the sick, cast out demons, and perform miracles of great power. But this was something entirely different. This was authority over the elements themselves. For a moment, there was no sound except the calm. The wind had stopped, the waves were now mere ripples, and the sky above them had cleared. The storm, which had moments earlier threatened to destroy them, was now completely still. The boat rocked gently on the water, no longer in danger of capsizing. The disciples, who had been on the edge of despair just moments before, were now overwhelmed with awe and wonder. They had feared for their lives, but now, in the silence that followed Jesus' command, they were filled with a sense of reverence. They looked at each other in disbelief, trying to process what had just happened. Who was this man? How could he control the wind and the waves with just a word? Their fear of the storm had been replaced by a reverence and awe for the one who had the power to calm it with a single command. "Who is this?" they whispered to each other, their voices filled with awe. "Even the wind and the waves obey him." The question hung in the air as the disciples began to realize the profound truth of who Jesus was. He was not merely a teacher or a healer. He was the Creator himself, the one with authority over all things. In that moment, their understanding of Jesus deepened. He was not bound by the limitations of the natural world. He was the master of it. The storm had revealed something they had yet to fully grasp, that Jesus was not just a man, but the Son of God, with power over all creation. As the boat continued its journey, the disciples were left in awe, their hearts filled with wonder and a renewed sense of faith. The storm had not only been calmed, but their understanding of Jesus had been transformed. He was no longer just the man who performed miracles. He was the one who commanded the very forces of nature. As the last remnants of the storm faded away, the boat drifted calmly on the waters, and a profound stillness filled the air. The wind had ceased, the waves had stilled, and the once turbulent sea now lay before them like a vast, peaceful mirror. The disciples, still in shock, looked around in disbelief, as if they were waking from a nightmare. The thunder no longer rumbled, and the sky had cleared. What had once been an all-consuming force of nature now seemed like a distant memory, and in its place, the stillness of the lake settled like a blanket over their troubled hearts. But it was not just the calmness of the sea that left the disciples in awe. It was the one who had brought it about. They had witnessed countless miracles. They had heard the teachings of Jesus. But this was something entirely different. In an instant, their world had gone from chaos to calm, from terror to peace, and all because of the voice of one man. The disciples could hardly comprehend what had just happened. They had watched in awe as Jesus had stood up in the face of the raging storm and simply spoken two words: "Peace, be still." Words that had been immediately obeyed by the forces of nature. It was as though the wind and the waves had no choice but to submit to his command. The elements themselves had been subdued, and for the first time, the disciples saw Jesus in a way they had never seen him before. As the boat gently swayed in the now tranquil waters, the disciples exchanged glances, but there was no need for words. Their minds were reeling from what they had just witnessed. They had followed Jesus for a long time, had listened to his teachings, and had seen him perform incredible miracles. But this was unlike anything they had ever experienced. This was not just a healer or a teacher. It was a divine act, a demonstration of power that went beyond their comprehension. They had known Jesus to heal the sick, cast out demons, and perform incredible wonders. But now they were seeing him as the Lord over all creation itself. The storm had revealed to them the true nature of Jesus' power. It was in this moment that the disciples were confronted with a deeper understanding of who Jesus truly was. They had been following him, had listened to his words, and had witnessed his miracles. But now they saw him as more than just a prophet. They saw him as the one who could command the natural world itself. This was not just a man. They were in the presence of the Creator, the one who had authority over the wind, the sea, the sky, and everything within them. "Who is this?" they whispered in awe, their voices filled with amazement. The question echoed through the boat as the disciples struggled to understand what they had just witnessed. Even the wind and the waves obey him. The disciples had just been through the terror of the storm, but now they were faced with a new kind of fear, one that came from a deep sense of awe and wonder. It was a reverence that stirred something deep within their souls, a realization that the man who had been their teacher, their healer, and their friend was something far more than they had previously understood. He was the one who held the power of the universe in his hands, the one who could speak to the storm and calm it with a word. In that moment, the disciples were filled with both fear and awe. Fear because they realized just how little they truly understood about Jesus, about the one they had been following, and awe because they had seen with their own eyes the power and authority of the Creator, a power that was far beyond anything they had ever known. This was not just a miracle, it was a revelation. The storm had opened their eyes to the truth about Jesus, and in the stillness that followed, they began to see him in a new light. The fear that had gripped their hearts during the storm had now been replaced by a reverence that was rooted in a deeper understanding of who Jesus was. They were no longer just following a teacher or a healer. They were following the Son of God, the one who had authority over all things, the one who could calm the storm with a single word. They were in the presence of something far greater than they had ever imagined. As the boat continued its journey, the disciples were left in a state of quiet awe. The storm had passed, but the revelation of Jesus' power had not. Their hearts were still racing, their minds still reeling from the experience. What had just happened? They would talk about this moment for years to come, and they would remember the calm that followed the storm, the calm that had come not from their own efforts, but from the one who had power over the storm itself. As we reflect on the story of Jesus calming the storm, we are invited to step back from the chaos of our own lives and consider the peace that Jesus offers. The storm that raged in the lives of the disciples is a powerful metaphor for the storms we face every day. Storms of anxiety, stress, uncertainty, and fear. Just as the disciples found themselves in a storm that felt beyond their control, we often find ourselves overwhelmed by circumstances that seem too much to bear. In these moments, it's easy to feel like we're drowning, to feel helpless and lost. But this story reminds us that just as Jesus was with the disciples in their storm, he is with us in ours. The disciples, in their panic and fear, cried out to Jesus for help. They were terrified, not knowing what to do, unsure of what would happen next. How often do we find ourselves in similar situations when everything feels like it's spinning out of control, when we can't see the way forward and all we can do is cry out for help? This is where the beauty of this story lies. Jesus heard their cries. Even in the midst of the storm, he was listening, and when he awoke, he responded with the power and authority of the Creator. He didn't just offer comfort, he calmed the storm. This is the first lesson we can take from this story. Jesus has the power to calm the storms in our lives. When we are facing difficulties, when we feel like we are being tossed around by the winds of uncertainty, Jesus is there. He sees our struggles, he hears our cries, and he has the power to bring peace into our hearts. Just as he spoke to the wind and the waves, he speaks to the storms in our lives. And while the external circumstances may not always change immediately, Jesus offers us a peace that transcends our understanding, peace in the midst of the storm. However, the story doesn't just focus on the calm that follows the storm. It also draws our attention to the faith of the disciples, or rather, the lack of it. When the disciples woke Jesus in their panic, he gently rebuked them for their fear, asking, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" This question is not just for the disciples, it's for us too. How often do we allow fear to dictate our actions and our responses? How often do we let the storms of life overwhelm us, causing us to forget the power of the one who is with us? Jesus' question to his disciples invites us to examine our own faith. Are we trusting in his ability to calm our storms? Are we looking to him for peace in the midst of our trials, or are we letting fear and doubt control us? The disciples' reaction to Jesus' power is also a powerful reminder for us. When Jesus calmed the storm, the disciples were filled with awe and wonder, asking, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. Their question is one we can all ask in our own hearts. Who is this man? Who is this Jesus who commands the elements, who has authority over the storm? The answer is clear. Jesus is the Son of God, the creator of the universe, the one who holds all things together by his power. He is not just a teacher or a healer. He is the Lord of all creation. And just as the disciples were in awe of his power, we too should stand in awe of the one who is with us in the storms of life, offering us peace and rest. There's also a call in this story to trust Jesus in a deeper way. The disciples had followed him for a long time, seen his miracles, and heard his teachings. But in the storm, they were still afraid. This reminds us that faith is a journey of growing deeper in trust, in understanding, and in surrender. The disciples were still learning who Jesus was and what he was capable of, and we are on that same journey today. As we walk through life, we are constantly invited to trust Jesus more fully, to rest in his presence, and to let go of the fear that often controls. The peace that Jesus offers is not just the absence of chaos. It's a deep inner peace that comes from knowing that we are never alone. Even in our darkest moments, when the storms of life seem overwhelming, Jesus is there with us. He offers us peace that is not based on our circumstances, but on his presence and his power. The call of this story is to trust in Jesus, to turn to him when the storms of life come, and to remember that he is the one who can bring peace to our hearts, no matter what is happening around us. The disciples' faith was tested in the storm, and so is ours. But the beauty of this story is that even when our faith feels weak, Jesus is still with us. He still has the power to calm our fears and bring peace to our hearts. Thank you for joining us on this peaceful journey through the story of Jesus calming the storm. As you rest tonight, remember that no matter how fierce the storm may seem, Jesus is with you, bringing calm and peace to your heart. If you found comfort in this story, don't forget to subscribe to Religious Stories to Sleep. For more calming Bible stories that will guide you into restful sleep. May you find peace in his presence tonight and always. Good night.